Let's move on then, please, to item 8 on the agenda, which is the financial performance report. I'm going to invite Paul to speak to this.
Thank you, Chair. So the report you have in front of you is the outcome of the very detailed stocktake that we've done as at the end of September, both of the year-to-date performance and the forecast for the year going forward. Of course, all of the financial results of NHS England and the commissioning system are discussed in considerable length at the Finance and Investment Committee, but we thought, given that this is a half-year stocktake, it was worth just taking a few minutes to talk about some of the key points that you can see. I think the best place to see in overview what I want to describe is in Appendix 2 of the papers that have been circulated, which is the normal kind of structural summary of the numbers as they come through. So if you've all got that, I'll use that as the basis of what I'm going to say. If you look at the top block, you can see the CCG performance across the country. We're very slightly behind plan in the year-to-date overall, but expecting to finish the year slightly ahead of plan at 635 million, 23 million ahead of the plan. That's obviously in both cases within 0.1% of the target of the allocation that we've got. So I think you can view those in aggregate at least as being rounding differences rather than a significant trend of any sort. It's worth saying that within that 23 million forecast variance, the positive variance you can see on the right-hand side, there is an underspend of management costs of roughly a similar amount in the CCGs, which again I think is good news, because it's effectively the CCGs are reducing the amount they're spending on admin, and that obviously creates more money to be spent on healthcare. As always with a group of CCGs of this size and variety, there is a mixed picture if you look at the individual fortunes of CCGs. You can't see it on the piece of paper you've got in front of you here, but there are 54 CCGs who are ahead of plan by roughly 3 million each on average. Most of them, I have to say, in the north and in the centre of London, a theme I'll come back to. There are 40 who are expecting to be slightly behind plan, also by an average, as it happens, of about 3 million, the majority of which are in the Midlands and East region, and again you can see that in the picture that you see there. I have to report there are 24 CCGs who are currently forecasting to be in deficit at the end of the year, compared to 9 at the time we put the plans together. And there are a further 13 when we do the risk and mitigation analysis who've indicated a strong risk of moving into deficit if they can't correct the trends before the end of the year. And again, there's a distinct regional bias to this, with nearly half of that total of 37 CCGs at risk of deficit in the Midlands and East. And perhaps more importantly, it's quite difficult to avoid a conclusion that there's a linkage to the allocations discussion that we're due to have in December, when you reflect that 31 of the 37 who are at risk of deficit are in the category of those CCGs who are receiving less than our formula and target would therefore suggest they should get. And I mentioned already the highest surpluses are almost exclusively in CCGs in central London and the north, and each of those CCGs is currently receiving more than the formula suggests they should do. So that's a discussion for later, which we'll come back to in December, but there is a linkage, I think, between that issue and the varying performance of CCGs around the country. Not wishing to suggest, of course, that the only reason for anyone being in deficit or being in surplus is something to do with allocation. If I turn to direct commissioning, which is the block immediately below that, the real issue, of course, is, as we've previously discussed, specialised commissioning, where now all 10 area teams are forecasting overspends averaging 2.6%. This takes into account the baseline corrections which area teams have spent a long time in the last few months agreeing with their CCGs, and it's really a reflection that in a year of massive transition, and we've talked about that I think before, the number of moving parts that are in play on specialised commissioning is simply enormous. And in the light of the well-documented difficulties that we've had in disaggregating activity between specialised commissioning and routine acute commissioning, we've not really managed to have quite as much impact on the long-term historic trend of rapid growth in specialised commissioning as we would have wanted to have. And I think, just to reflect back, when we took the decision last December about allocating money to particular sectors, you'll remember that conversation. We talked about a wish to give more than real terms growth to CCGs to give them the best chance of succeeding in the first year. And we reflected at that time that the risk profile in specialised commissioning, given the amount of resource that left, if you like, for that purpose, was significantly higher. And I think we're seeing that particular risk coming through in the year that we're looking at. Now, as you can see, we can balance that off this year by using the surplus drawdown that we kept in reserve at the start of the year. That's the 303 million you see almost at the bottom of the table in front of you. But it gives us a real challenge as we move into 14-15, of course, because we need to address both the ongoing growth momentum in specialised commissioning and also correct the structural deficit, which, if you like, is emerging in the picture that we exit the year with. Now, clearly, I don't need to tell you that the 10 area teams around the country are doing absolutely everything in their power to minimise the amount of overspend that is going on in specialised commissioning, and secondly then to construct plans going forward to address the gap that I've just talked about. But on balance, the risks and opportunities that we've analysed as part of the stock take suggest that there's unlikely to be a significant improvement in the set of numbers that you see in front of you, and therefore I think we will have to address that problem over a longer time horizon. The other areas of direct commissioning that you can see reflected in that middle block are broadly performing in line with plan, with a bit of upside in primary care, balancing out additional demand for dental activity, which you can see in the table there, most of which is happening in London. The final bit of the picture then from me is NHS England's own running costs and central programme costs. The running costs you can see called out there explicitly. The central programme costs are slightly less easy to spot, but they are the line that's called other further down there. There has to be an other in every accountant's set of numbers, and that is it. But it is the 965 billion of central programme costs which we look after. The individual components of that are laid out in appendices 3 and 4 in more detail for those of you who want to look at those. If I start with running costs, the year to date has been underspent by 40 million or 14%, mainly due to significant numbers of vacancies, particularly in the early part of the year. In the second half of the year, we currently expect to be spending more in line with plan, so we don't see that positive variance, if you like, growing in the second half of the year, though I think on balance, as we look at it, there may be some smallish upsides which we'll be reviewing over the coming weeks and updating on. On programme costs, that's the other line, as I said, quite a number of areas have got off to a slow start, leading to an underspend year-to-date of 125 million. You can see those, as I say, set out in detail in the appendix that follows. But the forecast prepared by directorates suggests that a lot of that is a phasing difference rather than ultimately the budget's not getting spent. Again, we're going to go through quite a detailed review of that because we're learning about these budgets as we go through the year, and clearly it's important that we have a detailed understanding as to where they're headed to for the year. The only significant budgetary movement, to note in the programme costs is the increase in transitional support to providers that you can see on Appendix 4, where we've agreed with the Trust Development Authority an additional 60 million of support, which is going into trusts who need help with their transition programmes, particularly in the Midlands and East, and the financing of that, as you can see, has come out of the contingency at the bottom, so that's how that gets done. So that's really the forecast overall. I've mentioned at various points as I've gone through the fact that beyond the forecast we've done a detailed risk and mitigation analysis. That's set out in paragraphs 4 to 6 of the main report if you wanted to turn back to that, where we set out our overall conclusions. But the short version of the overall conclusions are that we can balance off, as we see it at the moment, the risks over and above this forecast with the mitigations there. The risks, predictably enough, are in the area of activity, uncertainties, the mitigations predominantly in the form of reserves in various parts of the system. So in toto, I can give you assurance, having done the risks and the mitigations, that we seem on track to deliver on our commitment to 534 million or more of surplus to be carried forward for future investment at the end of the year. The only thing I do need to draw your attention to is the very tight position on NHS England itself, which you can see again if you look at the appendix we started off with, Appendix 2. The position in NHS England itself, as represented by the forecast, if you combine the 60 million of deficit on national commissioning and the 21 million of surplus on other and remaining drawdown, means that we're quite tightly placed around a break-even position. It's obviously an important thing that we are committed to do this year to make sure that we live within our own resources. It is clearly much more complex for us to do that than an individual CCG because we're the conduit through which a lot of the funding of the system comes. But I think we have made a commitment to live within the resources that we've got, and managing to that very tight bottom line, I think, is something that we will need to keep a very close eye on as we go forward. That's really all I wanted to say about the finances. I hope that helped to give a bit of an overview as to where we're at. Happy, of course, to take questions.
Thank you, Paul. Questions to Paul?
No,
Ed.
just looking at this, it is tremendous the work you're doing to sort of keep on top of this. But your point about NHS England is it is a very, very tight, fine balance, principally driven by the direct commissioning challenges. I mean, I think in terms of substance, I hope the board would agree with me that there must be no circumstances on which we record a deficit in the current year. So we must do everything in our power and with other people's support to make sure that we have a surplus, even if it is a £1 surplus, it is a surplus rather than anything else. And David, I hope you would support that.
Yeah, I mean, can I say just a couple of things? Well, the first is just a broad point, which is to put all this in context. This is the fourth year where the NHS has had little or no growth, which is unprecedented in its history. Never in the NHS have we ever had to cope with 4 years of little or no growth, ever. The average has been between 4.5 and 4.8% since its inception. It's also, as far as I can see, unprecedented in healthcare systems in the rest of the developed world. Most of the other ones are either going for draconian cuts in the pay of healthcare workers or are cutting the offer to patients. And we're doing neither of those things. So it is a remarkable set of numbers, and people should be, I think the NHS have worked really hard to make this a reality. Having said all of that, it is very tight. And one of the things I think we need to make sure is that we keep the disciplines in all of this, because we know that when we lose control of money in the NHS, there are big, significant consequences for patients, and people have to make decisions that make short-term decisions, which sometimes act against the interests of patients. It's really important that we do that, and in particular around the NHS England position. We as they say, as an organisation, are in this for the long haul. This is not a short term. We don't want a short term fix. And whilst it may feel attractive to people to take some risks with the financial position over the next year or so, I think we should absolutely hold the line on all of this. And it's vitally important here that NHS England's delivered its financial duties, not least of all because we don't want to store up more problems for the future because of that long-term position that we need to take.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think the board are wholly behind the proposition that we do not wish to see a deficit in the current year. I think, secondly, we're very sympathetic to the real problems of demand management and specialised commissioning, and the sheer problem of getting a grip on that without entering into the territory of reducing services. And I'm sure this is going to come not only through the committee on the direct and specialised commissioning, but also come back to the board for future consideration. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that, Paul. May we then move to item 9, which is the board assurance framework. It's on our agenda simply to note today. So may I ask that you agree that we have noted it. Thank you very much.